If the truth arrives 1 minute too late, even innocence can sound like a lie. Claire Whitmore lifted her eyes toward the pale morning sky as silver clouds drifted slowly across the kingdom, wondering if this would be the last sunrise she would ever see. Around her, hundreds of wolves from every corner of the realm gathered in complete silence, their whispers carried by the cold breeze that rolled through the ancient stone square. Some stared with pity, many with suspicion, and others with quiet satisfaction, convinced they were about to witness justice. No one noticed how tightly Claire held her trembling hands together. She had already stopped trying to defend herself. 3 days of accusations, endless questioning, and sleepless nights had taken away every reason to argue. She had confessed. She had signed her own name beneath words she knew were false. To everyone watching, that confession was enough. An Omega who admitted her crime deserved whatever fate the council decided. Yet hidden beneath the weight of her silence rested a truth that no one had bothered to search for. Claire had never betrayed the kingdom. She had never stolen sacred records. She had never conspired against the Alpha Crown. She simply believed that protecting someone else's future was worth sacrificing her own. The elders had called it undeniable evidence. The nobles had called it justice. The crowd called her a traitor before the trial had even begun. Standing at the center of the square, she heard fragments of conversations drifting through the air. I knew she couldn't be trusted. She always looked too quiet. Confessing proves she's guilty. Every sentence settled on her shoulders like another invisible stone. Claire never answered. Her gentle blue eyes remained fixed on the horizon beyond the castle walls where the distant forest shimmered beneath the early sunlight. Somewhere beyond those trees, birds still sang as though nothing extraordinary was happening today. Somewhere, ordinary families prepared breakfast, children laughed, and life continued without knowing that one frightened Omega had decided to carry a burden that belonged to someone else. A royal banner fluttered above the council platform, displaying the silver wolf crest of the kingdom. The empty throne beside the judges caught Claire's attention for only a moment. The Alpha King had not attended the previous hearings. Rumors claimed he was traveling across distant territories, settling border disputes between powerful pacts. Others insisted he had already reviewed the case and agreed with the verdict without question. Claire no longer knew what to believe. She closed her eyes and remembered a promise she had made beneath a moonlit sky years ago, a promise that had seemed impossible to keep until fate demanded its full price. If remaining silent could save an innocent family from destruction, then perhaps her own life was a fair exchange. The thought should have terrified her, yet an unexpected calm settled inside her heart. She whispered a quiet farewell that no one else could hear. At that exact moment, far beyond the castle gates, the thunder of approaching horses echoed across the valley, and without realizing it, every second that remained before Claire's fate changed forever had already begun to disappear. 3 days earlier, before whispers became accusations and before silence became her only defense, Claire Whitmore woke to the familiar sound of rain tapping softly against the roof of the small cottage where she had lived since childhood. The morning smelled of pine trees and fresh earth, and for a brief moment the world felt ordinary. She swept the wooden floor, fed 2 abandoned wolf pups that often wandered onto her porch, and carried a basket of herbs toward the village healer before most of the pack had even begun their day. People accepted her kindness because it cost them nothing, but very few ever looked her in the eyes long enough to know the woman behind the quiet smile. Claire had spent years learning that being invisible was sometimes safer than demanding to be seen. As an Omega without influence or powerful relatives, she understood her place in the kingdom. She greeted everyone politely, accepted every difficult task without complaint, and returned home each evening believing that kindness still mattered even when no one noticed it. That belief was tested before noon. As she crossed the marketplace, 2 royal messengers arrived on horseback carrying sealed documents marked with the silver crest of the Alpha Crown. The cheerful conversation stopped immediately. Merchants abandoned their stalls. Children hurried toward their parents. Everyone sensed that something serious had happened inside the capital. One messenger unrolled the scroll and announced that confidential records from the royal archives had disappeared during the previous night. Until the missing documents were recovered, every pact connected to the capital would remain under investigation. Fear spread through the crowd faster than the wind. No one understood why ancient records could matter so much, yet everyone recognized the danger of becoming involved. Claire quietly lowered her eyes and continued walking, hoping to avoid unnecessary attention, but fate had already chosen another path. As she approached the healer's cabin, she noticed a frightened young servant named Emily sitting alone behind the building, crying so hard she could barely breathe. Claire knelt beside her and gently asked what had happened. Emily hesitated for a long moment before revealing a leather satchel hidden beneath her cloak. Inside rested several royal documents stamped with the same silver seal described by the messengers only minutes earlier. Claire's heartbeat slowed instead of racing. She did not ask how the papers had appeared. She only looked into Emily's terrified eyes and immediately realized the young woman had stumbled into something far beyond her understanding. Between broken sobs, Emily admitted she had found the satchel abandoned outside the archive after finishing her cleaning duties. Afraid no one would believe her innocence, she had hidden it instead of reporting it. Her father was already ill, her younger brothers depended on her wages, and one accusation would destroy her entire family. Claire listened without interrupting. She saw not a criminal but a frightened daughter trapped by fear. The easiest decision would have been to walk away. The safest choice would have been to tell the guards immediately. Instead, Claire quietly placed one hand over Emily's shaking fingers and made a promise that neither of them fully understood. She whispered that sometimes protecting another person required carrying a burden that should never have belonged to anyone at all. Emily stared at her in disbelief, unaware that those simple words would begin a chain of events leading Claire toward the silent square where the entire kingdom would soon believe she deserved to stand alone. Emily shook her head again and again, insisting that she would surrender herself before allowing Claire to carry the blame, but Claire gently closed the leather satchel and placed it back into the young servant's trembling hands. She spoke with the calm certainty of someone who had already accepted the cost of her decision. She explained that the kingdom rarely listened to frightened servants, especially those born without powerful family names. Fear would make Emily stumble through every answer, and frightened people were often mistaken for guilty ones. Claire, however, believed she could protect her long enough for the real truth to surface. Emily burst into tears and begged her not to do it, but Claire only smiled with quiet kindness. It was the same smile she offered lonely children, injured animals, and strangers who had forgotten what compassion looked like. Before either of them could decide another path, the sound of armored horses echoed through the narrow street. Royal investigators had already reached the village. Within minutes, guards began questioning everyone who had worked near the capital during the previous week. Every conversation grew tense. Every nervous glance became suspicious. Claire watched from a distance as Emily struggled to steady her breathing. She knew that one frightened expression would draw every eye toward the hidden satchel. Without hesitation, Claire stepped forward and asked to speak first. The captain of the investigators studied her carefully. He recognized her as an ordinary Omega with no reputation for dishonesty, making her unexpected request even more surprising. He asked whether she knew anything about the missing royal records. Claire paused only briefly before answering in a steady voice that she did. Gasps spread across the marketplace. Merchants abandoned their conversations. Even the guards exchanged uncertain looks. The captain ordered everyone else to remain silent while he questioned her privately, yet the entire village strained to hear every word. Claire admitted that she had taken possession of the documents. She did not explain where they came from. She did not accuse anyone else. She simply accepted responsibility. The captain frowned, expecting fear or excuses, but found neither. Instead he asked the question that would haunt the kingdom for days. Why would an Omega with no political influence steal records that she could never use? Claire lowered her eyes and quietly replied that some mistakes could not be explained without causing greater harm. Those mysterious words immediately became the center of every rumor. Within an hour, stories traveled across neighboring packs claiming she had worked for hidden enemies, sought revenge against the Alpha Crown, or hoped to sell royal secrets for gold. Each retelling grew more dramatic than the last. No one realized that the only thing Claire had truly stolen was another person's punishment. Emily watched everything from behind the healer's cabin, frozen between gratitude and unbearable guilt. Several times she nearly ran forward to confess everything, but each time Claire caught her eye with the smallest shake of her head. It was not an order. It was a promise. Claire would protect her until the very end if necessary. As the investigators escorted Claire toward the capital, villagers lined both sides of the road. Some looked away in disappointment. Others whispered that kindness had always been an act designed to hide darker intentions. Claire heard every word, yet none of them heard as much as the silence she left behind. Deep inside the royal castle, hundreds of miles of carefully guarded corridors concealed a truth that someone powerful desperately wanted to remain buried. And at that same moment, far beyond the northern mountains, King Adrian Ashford finished reading a routine report when one forgotten detail inside a single sentence caused him to stop walking, slowly lift his eyes, and ask a question that none of his advisors could immediately answer. King Adrian Ashford read the report twice before setting it quietly on the long oak table. Around him, advisors continued discussing border agreements, trade routes, and patrol schedules, but the Alpha King no longer heard a single word. His attention remained fixed on one sentence buried near the bottom of the page. It stated that the accused Omega had confessed immediately, refused legal counsel, and repeatedly declined every opportunity to reduce her punishment by identifying possible accomplices. Adrian slowly leaned back in his chair. In 20 years of studying criminal investigations across the kingdom, he had learned one simple truth. Guilty people almost always fought to save themselves. Innocent people sometimes accepted blame to protect someone they loved. He looked toward his chief advisor and calmly asked whether the investigators had discovered any financial motive, political alliance, or personal benefit connected to Claire Whitmore. The room fell silent. One official admitted there was none. Another explained that Claire owned almost nothing beyond a small cottage, a garden, and a few personal belongings. A third added that every witness described her as unusually generous, often helping neighbors without expecting payment or recognition. Adrian listened carefully before asking another question. Had anyone explained why such a woman would suddenly decide to steal confidential royal records she could neither understand nor sell? Again, no one answered. Instead, one elderly council member insisted that confessions spoke louder than unanswered questions. Adrian remained quiet for several long seconds. He had ruled the kingdom long enough to know that certainty built upon incomplete facts was one of the greatest dangers any ruler could accept. He ordered every document connected to the investigation delivered to his private study before sunset. Several advisors exchanged uneasy glances. Officially, the case had already been concluded by the regional court. Reopening it so late would embarrass respected judges. Adrian simply replied that protecting the reputation of the court could never become more important than protecting the truth itself. Hundreds of miles away, Claire entered the capital beneath gray afternoon skies. Citizens lining the street stopped their conversations as the escort passed through the main gate. Some whispered in disappointment because they had expected someone frightening, not a quiet young woman whose hands remained folded peacefully before her. Others searched her face for signs of hatred or defiance but found only exhaustion mixed with unexpected compassion. Claire even thanked the guard who offered her water after the long journey, leaving the young soldier uncertain whether he was escorting a dangerous criminal or someone caught inside a terrible misunderstanding. Inside the royal detention hall, she was shown to a modest stone room with a narrow window overlooking the palace gardens. As evening settled across the kingdom, golden light filtered through the glass and painted soft patterns across the floor. Claire sat beside the window, watching leaves sway gently in the breeze. She imagined Emily returning home safely to her father and younger brothers. That single thought gave her enough peace to endure everything else. She never realized that the satchel containing the missing records had already disappeared from the evidence chamber only hours after her arrival. Someone inside the palace clearly wanted certain secrets to remain hidden forever. That same night, Adrian entered his private library alone. He opened the investigation files one by one, comparing witness statements with official timelines until a small inconsistency caught his attention. One signature had been recorded nearly an hour before another document claimed Claire had first entered the archive. Both statements could not possibly be true. Adrian slowly closed the folder and looked toward the moon shining beyond the palace window. Then, in a calm voice that carried absolute authority, he summoned his most trusted investigator and delivered a single order. Do not search for a guilty woman. Search for the person who wanted an innocent one to confess. The investigation began before dawn, long before most of the kingdom stirred. Awake. Adrian trusted only 4 people with his order, and each understood that secrecy mattered more than speed. They quietly revisited every place connected to the missing records, not searching for what had disappeared but for what someone had tried to erase. Inside the royal archive, shelves stood perfectly organized, yet perfection itself raised suspicion. Dust covered hundreds of forgotten volumes, while one narrow section appeared recently cleaned. Adrian examined the shelves himself, his fingertips moving carefully across the polished wood until they stopped beside faint scratches hidden beneath the edge of a cabinet. The marks suggested that something much heavier than a stack of documents had been moved only days earlier. Nearby, an elderly archivist insisted nothing unusual had happened, but his nervous eyes drifted toward the eastern corridor each time Adrian mentioned the missing satchel. The Alpha King noticed every hesitation without revealing his thoughts. He thanked the old man politely and continued deeper into the archive. Meanwhile, Claire spent another quiet day inside her room overlooking the gardens. The guards had expected anger or desperate pleas, yet she greeted each of them with the same calm respect she offered everyone else. One young guard finally gathered enough courage to ask the question that had troubled him since her arrival. Why had she confessed so quickly if she believed she had done nothing wrong? Claire looked through the narrow window where golden leaves floated gently across the courtyard. She answered with a soft smile that sometimes the hardest promises were the ones no one else ever learned about. The guard wanted to ask more, but something in her peaceful expression convinced him that pressing further would only deepen her sorrow. Before leaving, he quietly placed an extra blanket beside her chair because the autumn nights had grown colder. Claire thanked him as though he had given her a priceless gift. Far across the palace, Adrian's investigators uncovered another unexpected detail. Every official record stated that Claire had carried the royal satchel from the archive into the marketplace. Yet none of the witnesses could describe the satchel itself. Some claimed it was brown leather. Others insisted it had been black. One even described metal locks that did not exist on royal archive cases. Adrian immediately understood what that meant. They had not remembered seeing the satchel. They had repeated details borrowed from one another after the arrest. The foundation of the testimony was weaker than anyone realized. Even more troubling, the original satchel listed in the evidence inventory could no longer be located. Someone had removed it after the investigation began. Adrian quietly dismissed the officials and stood alone beside a tall window overlooking the capital. The city below appeared peaceful beneath the afternoon sun, yet somewhere within those crowded streets walked the person who had carefully arranged every step of this deception. Whoever planned it had expected the case to end quickly, trusting that a humble Omega would never attract the personal attention of the Alpha King. They had underestimated one thing. Adrian valued truth more than convenience. Late that evening, one of his trusted investigators returned carrying a faded ledger discovered beneath loose floorboards inside an abandoned records office. Hidden between routine maintenance reports rested an unsigned note written only 4 days before the theft. It contained a single sentence that immediately changed everything. It read, "The witness will confess willingly because kindness has always been her greatest weakness." Adrian stared at the words without speaking. Someone had known Claire's character long before the investigation ever began. This had never been an accident. It had been a carefully prepared trap designed for one specific woman, and somewhere inside the palace walls, the person who wrote that sentence still believed their secret remained perfectly safe. The morning of the final hearing arrived beneath a sky so still that even the banners above the palace barely moved. Long before the council assembled, people from every neighboring pack had already crowded the capital square, eager to witness the conclusion of the kingdom's most talked-about trial. Rumors had traveled farther than truth ever could. Some claimed Claire Whitmore had confessed to protect foreign spies. Others insisted she had betrayed the Alpha Crown for wealth she had never possessed. By sunrise, very few remembered that no one had ever explained why an ordinary Omega would risk everything for documents she could neither read nor profit from. Inside her chamber, Claire quietly folded the blanket the young guard had given her the night before. She smoothed every wrinkle before placing it neatly on the chair, a simple act of gratitude that reflected the kindness she had never abandoned. When the same guard arrived to escort her toward the council hall, he hesitated before unlocking the door. He had spent the entire night wondering whether he had mistaken innocence for extraordinary courage. As they walked through the silent corridors, he finally whispered that if there was anything she wished to tell the judges before the verdict became final, today would be her last opportunity. Claire looked at him with gentle eyes and answered that some promises were heavier than chains, yet they were still promises worth keeping. The guard lowered his head, unable to find another question. At nearly the same moment, Adrian stood inside the royal strategy chamber surrounded by maps, reports, and the growing collection of evidence gathered during the previous day. His trusted investigator placed the faded ledger beside the missing witness statements that had quietly resurfaced overnight. One by one, small inconsistencies had begun fitting together like pieces of a hidden pattern. The archive inventory had been altered after Claire's arrest. The evidence satchel had disappeared while under official protection. Several testimonies repeated identical phrases despite coming from different witnesses. Most revealing of all, the mysterious note predicting Claire's confession had been written with ink supplied exclusively to senior palace administrators. Adrian realized the deception had not originated in a distant village. It had begun inside the palace itself. An advisor urged him to postpone the hearing immediately, warning that exposing corruption without complete proof could divide the kingdom. Adrian calmly replied that allowing a false judgment to proceed would divide it even more deeply. He ordered fresh horses prepared without delay. Outside, the council entered the grand hall as hundreds of spectators filled every available seat. Claire stood quietly before them, her expression unchanged despite the countless eyes fixed upon her. The chief judge reviewed the confession once more and asked whether she wished to withdraw any part of her statement. For the first time since her arrest, Claire slowly lifted her head and looked across the crowded chamber. She noticed Emily standing near the back beside her recovered father and younger brothers. Tears filled the young servant's eyes as she silently shook her head, begging Claire to stop sacrificing herself. Claire answered only with the smallest reassuring smile before turning back toward the judges. In a calm voice that carried throughout the hall, she repeated that her confession would remain unchanged. A wave of whispers swept through the crowd. Many believed they had just witnessed undeniable proof of guilt. Yet beyond the palace gates, the thunder of galloping horses echoed across the stone roads as Adrian and his escort raced toward the capital square. In his hand rested the ledger containing the sentence that changed everything, and as the palace bells began announcing the final stage of the proceedings, the Alpha King knew that every passing heartbeat brought the kingdom one step closer to condemning the wrong person. The chief judge slowly rose from his seat as the enormous hall fell into complete silence. Every eye remained fixed on Claire Whitmore, whose calm expression seemed almost impossible to understand. The royal clerk stepped forward carrying the parchment that contained her signed confession, while another official prepared to announce the council's final judgment. The spectators leaned forward in anticipation, believing they were about to witness the end of a story they already understood. Claire closed her eyes for only a brief moment, not to pray for herself but to hope that Emily and her family would live peacefully once this painful chapter finally ended. Across the chamber, Emily could no longer remain still. Tears streamed down her face as guilt overwhelmed every promise Claire had tried to protect. She took one trembling step forward before her father gently caught her arm, unable to understand why his daughter looked so terrified. Emily whispered that she had to tell the truth, but fear froze her voice before anyone else could hear it. At that very instant, the heavy doors of the council hall swung open with a deep echo that silenced every whisper inside the chamber. Dozens of royal guards immediately stepped aside as King Adrian Ashford entered with calm, measured steps. He wore no ceremonial crown and carried no weapon, only a worn leather ledger beneath one arm. The judges immediately stood to greet their king. The spectators followed, lowering their heads in respect. Claire slowly opened her eyes, surprised to see the Alpha King standing only a few yards away. Adrian did not look toward the council first. His attention settled briefly on Claire's exhausted face before turning to the assembled judges. In a voice that was steady rather than loud, he issued a single command. The judgment is suspended. Confusion spread across the hall like a sudden gust of wind. One council elder respectfully reminded the king that the accused had already confessed freely before multiple witnesses. Adrian nodded without argument. He calmly replied that a confession answered only one question. It revealed who accepted blame. It did not always reveal who committed the act. The chamber fell silent once again. Adrian walked toward the center of the room and placed the faded ledger beside Claire's written confession. He then requested that the chief archivist step forward. The elderly official approached cautiously, visibly unsettled as Adrian opened the ledger to a marked page. Without accusation or anger, the Alpha King asked whether the handwriting on the unsigned note appeared familiar. The archivist studied it for several long seconds before quietly admitting that the ink and writing style matched records prepared inside the senior administrative office of the palace. Murmurs rippled through the spectators. Adrian then presented the altered inventory showing that the evidence satchel had disappeared after entering official custody. Next came the contradictory witness statements describing entirely different satchels, followed by the impossible timeline proving Claire could not have signed one archive record before entering the building according to another official document. Each piece alone raised doubt. Together they formed a pattern too obvious to ignore. The judges exchanged uneasy glances as certainty slowly gave way to uncertainty. Then Adrian read aloud the single sentence hidden inside the faded ledger. The witness will confess willingly because kindness has always been her greatest weakness. The words settled over the chamber with astonishing weight. Every person present understood their meaning. Someone had expected Claire to sacrifice herself long before the investigation had even begun. Adrian closed the ledger and turned toward Claire. For the first time since entering the hall, he asked her a question no one else had thought to ask. "Lady Claire, whose future were you trying to protect?" Claire lowered her eyes as tears quietly gathered for the first time since her arrest. Before she could answer, a trembling voice broke through the stunned silence from the back of the chamber. "She was protecting mine." Emily stumbled into the center of the chamber with tears streaming down her face, her trembling hands clasped tightly together as though she could somehow hold herself together through sheer determination. Every pair of eyes followed her as she fell to her knees before the council. Her father rushed after her, confused and frightened, but Emily gently stopped him before looking directly at King Adrian. Her voice shook so badly that the first words barely escaped her lips. She admitted that she had found the royal satchel abandoned outside the archive after finishing her duties. She confessed that panic had overwhelmed her because she knew no one would believe a servant with no influence and no powerful family. She admitted that Claire had discovered her hiding behind the healer's cabin and had immediately understood what fear had done to her. The hall remained completely silent as Emily explained that Claire had never touched the missing records until she took responsibility for them in order to protect an innocent family from being destroyed by suspicion. Every sentence felt heavier than the one before it. Claire quietly lowered her head, not because she regretted her choice but because she never wanted Emily to carry such unbearable guilt. King Adrian listened without interrupting. When Emily finished, he turned toward the judges and calmly asked whether any evidence remained proving that Claire had stolen the documents for personal gain. None of the council members answered. The accusations that had once sounded so certain now seemed painfully fragile. Adrian then instructed his chief investigator to escort the senior palace administrator into the chamber. A middle-aged official stepped forward under the watch of 2 royal guards, his confident expression fading as the Alpha King placed the altered archive inventory beside the recovered maintenance ledger. Adrian did not accuse him immediately. Instead, he quietly asked why official records had been rewritten after the investigation began and why evidence stored under royal protection had mysteriously disappeared. The administrator attempted to explain the inconsistencies as clerical mistakes, but his answers collapsed beneath the growing weight of the documents. The chief archivist confirmed that only a handful of senior administrators possessed both the authority and the ink used to create the hidden note predicting Claire's confession. Another records officer admitted that he had been instructed to rewrite the archive timeline without asking questions. Piece by piece, the carefully constructed deception unraveled before everyone watching. The spectators who had whispered against Claire only moments earlier now stood speechless. Some lowered their eyes in quiet shame. Others remembered every cruel rumor they had repeated without ever questioning whether it was true. Adrian allowed the silence to settle over the chamber before speaking again. His voice remained calm, yet every word carried unmistakable authority. He declared that justice built upon fear was not justice at all. He reminded the council that the strength of a kingdom was measured not by how quickly it punished the weak but by how carefully it protected the innocent. Then he walked toward Claire and personally untied the simple cord that marked her as a convicted prisoner. The entire hall watched without breathing as the Alpha King stepped back and addressed the kingdom. He formally declared Claire Whitmore completely innocent of every accusation. Her confession would be removed from every royal record, her name fully restored, and a new investigation would continue against those who had manipulated the truth from within the palace itself. For several long seconds, no one moved. Then, one by one, people throughout the chamber slowly bowed their heads toward the quiet Omega they had condemned only hours before. Claire looked around the hall in disbelief, overwhelmed not by triumph but by the realization that compassion had finally been answered with truth. As she raised her eyes toward Adrian, she noticed something unexpected in his steady gaze. He was no longer looking at her as a ruler looked upon a citizen. He was looking at her as though he had just discovered someone the moon itself had been quietly guiding toward him all along. The great hall remained silent long after the council had withdrawn. One by one, the spectators slowly left the chamber, each carrying the uncomfortable weight of realizing how easily fear had replaced compassion. Claire Whitmore stood where she had been only moments before, still struggling to believe that the burden she had accepted was finally gone. She watched Emily embrace her father and younger brothers, their faces filled with relief instead of despair, and for the first time in many days, Claire allowed herself to breathe without feeling the crushing weight of guilt pressing against her heart. Emily hurried toward her, tears flowing freely as she apologized again and again for allowing someone else to sacrifice everything in her place. Claire gently embraced the young woman and reminded her that courage was not measured by never being afraid. True courage was choosing to speak when the truth finally needed a voice. Emily nodded through her tears, promising that she would spend the rest of her life honoring the kindness that had saved her family. As the two women stepped apart, King Adrian Ashford approached with the same calm presence that had steadied the entire kingdom only minutes earlier. There was no audience left to impress and no council remaining to persuade. Only the Alpha King and the quiet Omega faced one another beneath the afternoon light pouring through the tall windows. Adrian thanked Claire, not for enduring false accusations, but for reminding him why justice required patience before judgment. He admitted that many rulers would have accepted the confession without asking another question, and that had he returned from the Northern Territories one day later, the truth might never have been discovered. Claire quietly answered that she had never expected anyone to come searching for her innocence. She had simply hoped that one family would survive with their future intact. Adrian regarded her thoughtfully before saying that people often believed strength belonged only to warriors, yet he had witnessed a different kind of strength standing before the entire kingdom. The strength to protect another person without expecting recognition was far rarer than power. As those words settled between them, a gentle breeze drifted through the open windows, carrying the fragrance of pine and wildflowers from the palace gardens. Almost unnoticed, a faint silver glow shimmered across the back of Claire's wrist. She instinctively looked down, surprised to see a delicate crescent-shaped mark slowly appearing beneath her skin. At the very same moment, Adrian felt a familiar warmth spread across his own wrist. He rolled back the sleeve of his royal coat and discovered the identical silver mark glowing softly against his hand. Neither of them spoke. The palace attendants standing nearby exchanged astonished glances before quietly lowering their heads. Among wolves, everyone recognized the ancient sign described in stories passed down for generations. The moon goddess revealed the bond only after truth had overcome deception and two hearts had been tested beyond fear. Adrian looked into Claire's eyes, not with possession or triumph, but with deep respect. He smiled for the first time that day and softly said that destiny had waited until the kingdom learned the difference between confession and truth before revealing its own judgment. Claire felt warmth replace the loneliness she had carried for so many years. She understood that the greatest reward was not the mysterious mark glowing beneath her skin. It was knowing that kindness had never been foolish, even when the world misunderstood it. As evening sunlight bathed the palace in golden light, the people leaving the capital carried home a story that would be remembered for generations. They would not remember an Omega who confessed. They would remember a woman whose compassion proved stronger than fear, a king who refused to mistake certainty for justice, and a kingdom forever changed by the simple decision to search for the truth before passing judgment.